Emily Carter's feet left the mat for a split second as the black belt's arms cinched around her neck, the training room erupting with whistles before the silence of held breath swallowed them whole. "Don't forget who I am," the man hissed through clenched teeth, tightening just enough to turn the demonstration into a public humiliation, and every student lining the edge of the dojo leaned forward expecting the petite, civilian instructor to panic. She didn't. Her hands never clawed at his arm. Her breathing slowed instead of quickened. Her eyes stayed fixed on the exit as if she had already noticed something nobody else had. "Tap," another instructor barked with a grin. "Or admit you don't belong here." Emily answered neither command. Instead, she shifted one foot exactly 3 inches, lowered her center of gravity, and relaxed her shoulders in a way so subtle that almost everyone missed it. The black belt frowned. Whatever he expected to feel wasn't happening. His grip should have forced a desperate struggle by now, yet the woman in his hold seemed almost impossibly calm. Then she spoke, not to him, but quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "You're standing on your own escape route." Before anyone understood what she meant, she rotated her hips just enough to steal his balance without striking him, forcing him to widen his stance instinctively to avoid falling. The choke loosened for less than half a second. Emily slipped free with a movement so economical it barely looked like movement at all, took 2 controlled steps backward, raised both open hands to shoulder height, and calmly said, "We're here to train, not to prove who can hurt who." Instead of applause, laughter broke out. "Lucky escape," someone shouted. He was going easy on her. Another student pulled out a phone, eager to capture what everyone assumed would be the second and final round of embarrassment. The black belt rolled his shoulders, smiling wider now than before. "You got out once," he said loudly enough for the room to hear. "Don't mistake technique for superiority." Emily simply nodded. "Neither should you." Her answer only fueled more smirks. The senior coach folded his arms, but didn't intervene. This was supposed to be a guest demonstration, yet curiosity had quietly replaced professionalism. Everyone wanted to know whether the quiet woman who claimed to teach defensive tactics could survive against someone with years of competitive credentials. The black belt circled again, faster this time, forcing Emily to retreat across the mat. She gave ground without looking rushed, reading every angle instead of chasing one. Her shoes never scraped. Her posture never broke. More than one experienced observer noticed something unsettling. She wasn't watching his hands. She was watching his shoulders, hips, breathing, and feet all at once. It wasn't how tournament fighters usually tracked an opponent. It looked different. Military, perhaps. But before anyone could finish that thought, the front entrance opened with a metallic click. A tall man in jeans and a navy windbreaker stepped inside, carrying a gym bag over one shoulder. Nobody greeted him. Nobody recognized him. He paused just beyond the doorway, as if frozen by a photograph only he could see. His eyes never wandered around the room. They locked directly onto Emily. On the mat, the black belt lunged again, determined to end the exchange decisively before the newcomer could even set down his bag. Emily pivoted exactly 1 step to her left, avoiding the line of force by inches rather than feet, her expression unchanged. The stranger's grip tightened around the strap of his bag. His jaw stiffened. Under his breath, almost too quietly for anyone else to hear, he whispered, "No, it can't be." And for the first time that afternoon, someone in the building looked less concerned about the black belt than about the woman everyone believed was losing. The room should have relaxed after Emily escaped the choke, but the opposite happened. The students sensed unfinished business, and that unfinished business quickly turned into expectation. The black belt rolled his neck once, pointed toward the center circle, and smiled as though the first exchange had only been a warm-up. "Again," he said. "This time, no excuses." Emily glanced at the senior coach instead of answering him. "If this is still a demonstration," she said calmly, "then everyone watching should leave knowing something useful." The coach shrugged. "Teach us, then." Several students laughed. One muttered that surviving another 30 seconds would already be an accomplishment. Emily stepped back onto the mat anyway, her breathing steady, her hands open instead of clenched into fists. She looked at the polished floor for only a heartbeat before lifting her eyes again. "There is a slick spot," she said quietly. "About 18 inches behind your left heel." The black belt looked over his shoulder, saw nothing obvious, and laughed louder. "Trying to distract me?" Emily simply answered, "I am trying to keep someone from getting hurt." Nobody moved. Nobody checked. The senior coach waved impatiently. "Continue." The consequence arrived almost immediately. The black belt drove forward aggressively, planted exactly where Emily had warned him not to, and his lead foot slid just enough to break his balance. He recovered before falling, but his rhythm disappeared. Emily instinctively reached forward, caught his elbow to stabilize him instead of exploiting the mistake, and released him before either of them hit the mat. The room felt noticeably quieter. She had protected the very person trying to embarrass her. Instead of appreciating it, the black belt's expression hardened. "You planned that," he snapped. "You knew I would step there." Emily shook her head once. "No. I noticed the cleaning solution reflecting off the lights." Several students immediately looked toward the floor. Only then did they notice the faint streak left by a freshly mopped section that blended almost perfectly into the polished surface. One student stopped recording and frowned. Another whispered that he had walked across the same spot 5 minutes earlier without ever seeing it. The quiet man near the entrance never took his eyes off Emily. His gym bag remained hanging from one shoulder, untouched. His expression had shifted from curiosity to concentration. He was no longer watching the sparring match. He was watching the decisions. Emily had avoided striking, avoided embarrassing her opponent, and prevented an unnecessary fall in less than 2 seconds. The sequence seemed oddly familiar to him, but the memory refused to surface. The black belt circled again, slower now. Confidence had given way to caution. "Enough games," he said. "If you know so much, stop moving and defend yourself." Emily lowered her hands another inch instead of raising them. "You are breathing through your mouth," she replied. "Your right shoulder is tightening. You are going to commit too much weight on your next entry." The students exchanged puzzled looks. It sounded less like trash talk than an observation. "You cannot predict that," someone called from the edge of the mat. Emily did not respond. The black belt launched forward exactly as he intended, but halfway through the movement, his right shoulder dipped first, forcing him to overextend. Emily sidestepped only enough to redirect the momentum with her forearm, allowing him to regain his footing without crashing into the mat. She never counterattacked. She never even attempted to score a point. The silence spreading through the room felt heavier than applause. A young assistant coach folded his arms and quietly asked, "Who teaches footwork like that?" No one answered. The stranger at the entrance finally shifted his weight, taking one slow step inside the dojo. His eyes dropped briefly to Emily's wrist as she adjusted the sleeve of her training jacket after the exchange. For less than a second, something faded and worn disappeared beneath the fabric before anyone else could make it out. His breathing caught. His face lost every trace of uncertainty. He tightened his grip on the gym bag until his knuckles turned pale, then started walking toward the mat with unmistakable purpose. The moment the stranger stepped toward the mat, the senior coach raised one hand to stop him. "This class is closed," he said firmly. The man nodded without arguing, but he did not leave. Instead, he answered with quiet confidence. "Then let the class finish." His voice carried just enough authority to make several students glance at him before looking back at Emily. The interruption only irritated the black belt further. "Nobody walks onto my floor and tells me how to train," he snapped. He turned back toward Emily. One clean exchange. No stepping away this time. Emily studied him for a second longer than before. "If that is what you want," she replied. "But stop chasing the head. You are leaving your balance behind every time." The warning sounded sincere rather than sarcastic, and that somehow frustrated him even more. He charged again, faster than any previous attempt, determined to overwhelm her before she could analyze another movement. This time, Emily did not retreat. She waited until the final instant, shifted less than a foot to her right, redirected his forward pressure with both palms against his shoulder and upper arm, and let his own momentum carry him into an empty lane. He stumbled 2 controlled steps before catching himself without falling. Emily never pursued him. She simply reset her stance and lowered her hands once more. A hush settled over the dojo. Nobody could deny what they had just witnessed. She had neutralized a committed attack without striking, grabbing, or forcing the exchange. The assistant coach slowly uncrossed his arms. "Run that back," he whispered almost to himself. She did not beat his strength. She erased it. The students who had laughed minutes earlier were no longer smiling. Several unconsciously mimicked Emily's foot placement on the edge of the mat, trying to understand what their eyes had just seen. The black belt rolled his shoulders again, but this time uncertainty crept into his expression. Emily had not embarrassed him. Somehow that made the situation even harder to explain. "Do it again," he demanded. Emily shook her head gently. "Repeating the same mistake teaches neither of us anything." The sentence landed differently than the others. It was not an insult. It sounded like something an instructor would say after years of teaching professionals rather than beginners. The senior coach took one slow step closer. For the first time that afternoon, he was not looking at the black belt. He was watching Emily's posture. Her eyes never wandered around the room. She tracked every person entering her peripheral vision without appearing distracted. Even while speaking, she subtly repositioned herself so no student stood directly behind her. It was such an automatic habit that she seemed completely unaware she was doing it. The coach frowned. Competitive fighters usually faced opponents. She quietly managed the entire room. Near the entrance, the stranger's breathing slowed. Emily brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and the sleeve of her training jacket slipped back for another brief instant. The worn edge of a faded bracelet appeared before disappearing beneath the cuff again. The man's eyes narrowed. It was not the bracelet itself that caught his attention. It was the unconscious way she adjusted it before stepping back into open space, exactly as someone would secure equipment before beginning a mission. He had seen that motion years ago, more times than he could count, but never inside a civilian dojo. "Who are you?" he whispered under his breath. Nobody heard him. The black belt was already making another decision. Pride had given way to frustration, and frustration was replacing discipline. Instead of circling, he closed the distance abruptly and reached for a standing clinch, hoping to force Emily into a position where experience and strength would matter more than timing. Emily's eyes changed almost imperceptibly. She did not look afraid. She looked alert. Before his hands could settle, she calmly said, "If you keep your thumb there, you're going to injure your own wrist." He ignored her completely. Less than a second later, his grip collapsed awkwardly exactly where she had predicted, forcing him to release and instinctively shake out his hand. It was not a serious injury, but it was enough to stop the exchange. Nobody spoke. The students stared first at the black belt, then at Emily, then back again. She had warned him before every mistake, and every warning had quietly come true. The stranger finally set his gym bag on the floor. His expression no longer carried curiosity. It carried recognition struggling to break through memory. He took another deliberate step toward the mat, his eyes fixed on Emily as though one final detail was all he needed to remember where he had seen her before. The stranger's next step was interrupted by the sharp whistle of the senior coach. Everybody freeze. Every student stopped moving, but Emily had already stepped backward until the entire class remained inside her field of view without seeming to look around at all. The adjustment was so natural that almost nobody noticed it except the man near the entrance. His eyes narrowed. Most instructors watched the person in front of them. Emily instinctively watched every doorway, every blind corner, every moving body. The senior coach looked from the black belt to Emily, then made a decision that changed the atmosphere. "One final demonstration," he announced. "No competition, Show everyone how you keep control without escalating. The room relaxed slightly, believing the confrontation was finally ending. Emily gave a quiet nod and walked toward the center of the mat, but instead of facing her opponent immediately, she bent down and straightened one loose edge of the training mat that had lifted only a fraction of an inch. Several students exchanged puzzled looks. It seemed like an unnecessary interruption until one teenager carrying focus pads hurried across the same spot seconds later. His shoe caught the raised edge for an instant before sliding safely over the now flattened surface. He never realized he had almost stumbled while carrying equipment. Emily simply stood back up as though nothing unusual had happened. No speech. No explanation. The assistant coach stared at the floor, then back at her. She had noticed a hazard no one else had even seen while everyone was focused on the sparring. The consequence was immediate. Instead of dismissing her observations as coincidence, several students unconsciously began checking their own footing before moving. The dojo itself seemed quieter, more deliberate. The black belt folded his arms impatiently. "Can we stop inspecting the building now?" he asked. Emily turned toward him without irritation. "The floor matters before the technique." He laughed once, but fewer people joined him this time. The stranger remained silent, yet another detail settled into place inside his memory. It was not merely how she moved. It was the order in which she solved problems. She removed small risks before larger ones appeared. He had seen entire teams trained that way years ago, but only in places where mistakes carried consequences far beyond losing a sparring match. The thought unsettled him. If she learned that somewhere, who had taught her? The senior coach clapped once to restart the exercise. "Controlled entry," he instructed. "Half speed." The black belt agreed with a curt nod, but frustration lingered beneath the surface. He stepped in carefully this time, slower than before, clearly trying not to repeat earlier mistakes. Emily mirrored his movement without touching him, quietly adjusting the distance by inches instead of feet. Every time he changed direction, she had already created an angle where neither person would collide awkwardly. Watching them felt strangely different now. It no longer resembled a contest. It resembled someone silently guiding another person away from errors before they happened. One student whispered, "She is teaching him without saying it." Another answered, "I do not think he realizes it." That realization created a new kind of tension. If Emily was capable of controlling the pace this precisely, why had she allowed herself to appear vulnerable when the session began? Before anyone could answer that question, the assistant coach hurried toward the equipment rack after noticing two heavy kicking shields leaning precariously near the edge. As he reached for them, one shield shifted unexpectedly toward a group of younger students. Emily moved first. She did not run. She simply took 2 quick steps, caught the falling shield before it gathered momentum, and set it back upright without startling anyone. The younger students barely looked up from tying their gloves. The assistant coach stopped halfway across the room, realizing she had reacted before he had even recognized the problem. He slowly lowered his hands. The stranger's heartbeat quickened. It was never the speed that bothered him. It was the anticipation. Emily was consistently responding to events before everyone else accepted they were happening. He finally looked away from her for the first time, searching his own memory instead. Somewhere, years earlier, he had watched someone teach that exact habit. When he looked back, Emily was already facing the black belt again, calm as ever, while the senior coach took one step closer and quietly announced, "This next exchange starts from a standing clinch." The stranger's expression changed instantly. He opened his mouth as though to stop the exercise, but the black belt had already stepped forward, and Emily had already raised her hands. The senior coach barely finished the words "standing clinch" before the black belt stepped forward, determined to reclaim control of the room. Emily raised her hands slowly, not in challenge, but in readiness, her feet settling into the same quiet stance that had puzzled everyone all afternoon. The instant the clinch was established, the black belt attempted to lock his position and drive Emily backward with steady pressure. Instead of resisting force with force, Emily shifted her weight, angled her hips, and calmly redirected the pressure into empty space. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. The black belt found himself turning, not falling, his own momentum carrying him harmlessly past her before he stopped several feet away, completely off balance, and staring back in disbelief. Nobody cheered. The silence that followed carried far more weight than applause. Every student understood they had just watched something they had never been taught. Emily had solved the problem without striking, without overpowering anyone, and without humiliating her partner. She simply stepped back into a neutral stance and lowered her hands again as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The senior coach looked from the black belt to Emily, then slowly shook his head. Again, the black belt demanded, breathing harder now. Emily answered quietly, "Not until you reset your footing. Right now you are thinking about winning instead of learning." The words should have sounded insulting, yet they landed like simple instruction. The black belt instinctively glanced down at his own feet before realizing he had obeyed her without thinking. That single reaction spread through the room faster than any explanation could have. Students who had mocked her only minutes earlier now copied her stance instead of his. Even the assistant coach unconsciously mirrored the angle of her lead foot while replaying the exchange in his mind. The atmosphere inside the dojo shifted. Emily had not defeated anyone. She had quietly become the person everyone was watching. Near the entrance, the stranger finally took another step forward. This time nobody stopped him. His eyes never left Emily as fragments of memory aligned one after another. The way she scanned every doorway before moving. The way she corrected hazards before beginning instruction. The way she redirected force without unnecessary aggression. The way she never celebrated a successful technique. He had spent years around men and women who trained exactly that way. Those habits were never accidental. They were built through thousands of disciplined repetitions under conditions where mistakes carried consequences no civilian class could imagine. His breathing slowed. The uncertainty that had followed him since walking through the door finally disappeared. Emily turned slightly, as if sensing someone approaching, but remained focused on the class. She never acknowledged the stranger directly. He stopped several feet from the edge of the mat, removed his gym bag from his shoulder, and stood perfectly still. The room noticed him only because he suddenly came to attention without being asked. His posture was unmistakable. Several veterans among the students immediately recognized it. The senior coach frowned. "Sir, do you know her?" The stranger did not answer immediately. He looked at Emily for another long second before speaking in a calm voice that carried effortlessly across the silent dojo. "I know that style." Every eye shifted toward him. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Emily remained exactly where she was, her expression unchanged. The stranger continued, choosing every word carefully. "Very few people in this country teach movement like that." He never mentioned a unit. He never mentioned a mission. He never spoke about her past. Yet his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone recognizing something deeply familiar. The students looked back at Emily with entirely different eyes. Their questions had changed. They were no longer wondering whether she was skilled. They were wondering where someone learned to move like that. Before anyone could ask another question, the black belt stepped forward once more, pride refusing to surrender. "If you know so much," he said, "then stop demonstrating and finish the match." Emily met his eyes for the first time in several minutes. She did not look angry. She looked disappointed. "This was never a match," she replied softly. At that exact moment, the stranger drew a slow breath, looked directly at her, and spoke her name with unmistakable recognition. "Emily Carter." The entire dojo turned toward him as if the air itself had changed, and the look on his face made one thing painfully clear. Whatever he had just remembered was far bigger than anyone in that room was prepared to hear. Emily did not react when the stranger spoke her name. Instead, she looked at the black belt, lowered her hands, and quietly said, "Training ends the moment people stop learning." The words dissolved the last trace of confrontation, but they created something far more difficult to ignore. Every student was now watching the stranger instead of the sparring mat. He stepped forward at an unhurried pace, stopping several feet away as though crossing an invisible line required permission. "You probably do not remember me," he said. Emily studied his face for a long moment before answering with a faint smile. "People change." He nodded once. "Some of us do. Some lessons never do." The exchange raised more questions than answers. They clearly recognized one another, yet neither spoke about where they had met. The silence between them carried the weight of shared experience without revealing its source. The senior coach looked from one to the other. "Would somebody mind telling us what is going on?" Neither answered immediately. Emily reached down instead and picked up one of the training pads that had been left near the edge of the mat, placing it neatly back on the equipment rack before anyone could trip over it. The simple action seemed almost insignificant until the stranger smiled to himself. She still solved the smallest problem in the room before addressing the largest one. The habit had survived the years unchanged. One of the older students finally broke the silence. "Sir, how do you know her?" The stranger rested his eyes on Emily before speaking carefully. "A long time ago I attended a defensive tactics course that was canceled halfway through." He paused as if weighing every word. "Canceled because the instructors were reassigned overnight." A few students exchanged confused glances. Emily quietly adjusted the sleeve of her training jacket, but said nothing. The stranger continued. "Before they left, one instructor spent less than an hour teaching us something I have used for the rest of my career. She never demonstrated how to win a fight. She demonstrated how to make sure everyone went home." He looked directly at Emily again. "I never forgot that lesson." The room became noticeably quieter. No one had heard of championships. No one had heard of trophies. What remained was a single memory about responsibility rather than victory, and somehow that made Emily seem even more remarkable. The assistant coach glanced around the dojo and suddenly realized something that had escaped everyone else all afternoon. Every correction Emily had made had protected someone. She had warned about the wet floor. She had flattened the raised edge of the mat. She had caught the falling shield. She had prevented awkward grips before they became injuries. She had never once tried to impress anyone. The pattern finally revealed itself. The students were no longer admiring flashy technique. They were beginning to understand her priorities. The black belt slowly removed his gloves and looked at Emily with an expression completely different from the one he had worn an hour earlier. "You could have embarrassed me several times," he admitted quietly. Emily answered without hesitation. "Then nobody would have learned anything." The words landed harder than any technique could have. Even the senior coach lowered his eyes for a moment. The stranger reached into the side pocket of his gym bag and carefully removed a worn notebook with softened corners. He opened it slowly, turning pages that had clearly traveled for years. Between handwritten notes, old range diagrams, and faded training schedules rested a small folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it carefully. At the bottom, beneath a list of safety principles written in dark blue ink, appeared a short handwritten sentence. "Prevent the next mistake before it becomes the next emergency." The handwriting matched the notes Emily had quietly written on the whiteboard before class had started earlier that afternoon. The stranger looked at the sentence, then at Emily, his voice almost disappearing. "You wrote this." Emily did not deny it. She simply looked toward the students who had gathered closer together and said, "If they remember one thing today, let it be that." Nobody spoke. The sentence explained every decision she had made without explaining who she truly was. It answered why she moved the way she did, yet it left a far more powerful question hanging in the air. What kind of place teaches someone to think that way every second of every day? The stranger carefully folded the paper again, but as he slid it back into the notebook, a faded laminated card slipped free and drifted onto the mat. Before anyone could pick it up, every eye locked onto the weathered card lying face up between Emily and the stranger, and the expression on Emily's face changed for the very first time. The laminated card had barely touched the mat before Emily moved. She did not reach for it to hide it. She picked it up so no one would step on it, brushing away a speck of dust with the side of her thumb before holding it out toward the stranger. "You dropped this," she said quietly. Before he could take it, the senior coach caught a glimpse of the faded insignia printed across the top. His expression changed instantly. It was not the polished look of a souvenir or a public identification card. Years of wear had softened its edges, and the ink had faded from countless days spent inside a uniform pocket. The stranger accepted it carefully, almost respectfully. "I have carried this for 12 years, he said. "Because one instructor refused to let any of us leave until every person in the room knew how to bring the next person home." Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment. Then you remembered the important part. The consequence spread through the dojo without anyone saying another word. Every student suddenly understood that the techniques they had watched all afternoon were never about winning exchanges. They had been watching a way of thinking. The black belt slowly stepped back into the center of the mat and bowed his head. "One more demonstration," he asked, this time without pride. "Teach it correctly." Emily hesitated for the first time that day. She looked around the room, saw every student waiting, then quietly nodded. "Pair up," she instructed. "Nobody uses strength. Everybody protects their partner." Within seconds, the dojo transformed. Instead of one confrontation, a dozen training pairs began moving across the floor. Emily walked calmly among them, adjusting a wrist here, correcting a foot position there, preventing mistakes before they happened exactly as she had done from the moment she entered the building. When one student leaned too far forward, she guided his shoulder back before he lost balance. When another tightened a grip unnecessarily, she loosened 2 fingers instead of removing the hold completely. Every correction was precise, economical, and almost invisible. The stranger watched with unmistakable admiration. Finally, he looked toward the senior coach and spoke with complete certainty. "Now you understand why nothing she did looked familiar. She was never trying to defeat anyone. She was teaching professional protective movement disguised as ordinary self-defense." The words did not explain her past. They simply confirmed what everyone had already witnessed. The assistant coach slowly exhaled. "She has been teaching from the first second she walked through the door." Emily finished helping the final pair before returning to the center of the mat. The black belt looked at her with genuine respect. "I thought you were trying to prove you were better than me." Emily gave a small shake of her head. "If I leave someone feeling smaller, I failed as an instructor." The sentence landed deeper than any technique. The room remained completely silent. The stranger then stood perfectly straight, his posture unmistakable to anyone who had ever served. "Chief Petty Officer Daniel Brooks, United States Navy," he said calmly. "I completed survival and close quarters instruction many years ago." Emily Carter was one of the instructors assigned to our Advanced Defensive Movement program before the course was reassigned. The lessons she taught have stayed with me through every deployment since. He never exaggerated her role. He never turned her into a legend. He simply confirmed the truth everyone had already accepted through her actions. Several veterans in the class instinctively straightened where they stood. The black belt looked at Emily again, remembering his own words from earlier that afternoon. "Do not forget who I am." A faint smile finally appeared on Emily's face. "Nobody has to remind people who they are," she answered softly. "Your choices do that for you." The words settled over the dojo like a final lesson. Nobody applauded. Nobody rushed toward her. One by one, students quietly adjusted the loose equipment around the room, wiped moisture from the floor, and helped their partners reset the training space without being asked, copying the habits Emily had demonstrated all day rather than her techniques. Daniel watched the silent transformation with quiet satisfaction. The greatest lesson had not been how she escaped a hold. It was how she changed an entire room without raising her voice. As Emily picked up her small training bag and prepared to leave, the black belt stepped aside to clear her path before she even reached him. She thanked him with a simple nod and walked toward the exit. Daniel glanced once more at the worn laminated card in his hand, then looked back at Emily as another memory surfaced, one he had not shared with anyone inside the dojo. His expression grew thoughtful, and before the door closed behind her, he quietly said, "There is still one lesson you never finished teaching us." Emily had almost reached the doorway when she noticed a pair of training gloves resting alone on the edge of the mat. Without a word, she turned back, picked them up, brushed a trace of chalk from the leather, and placed them neatly beside the equipment rack where their owner would find them. No one had asked her to do it. No one would have blamed her for walking away after everything that had happened. Yet the smallest unfinished task still mattered to her. The students watched quietly. Earlier that afternoon, they had mistaken those habits for caution. Now they understood they were expressions of responsibility. The black belt crossed the room before Emily could reach the exit again. This time there was no challenge in his posture. He simply extended both hands and accepted the gloves she was carrying instead of letting her put them away herself. Then, without speaking, he turned toward the younger students and began straightening the remaining equipment exactly as she had done throughout the day. One by one, others joined him. Nobody instructed them. Nobody organized them. Within minutes, the noisy dojo had transformed into a room where everyone quietly looked for the next small task that would help someone else. The assistant coach smiled as he watched the change spread from person to person. Earlier, they had admired techniques. Now they were imitating character. Emily paused only long enough to help a teenage student tighten a loose wrist strap that had been fastened incorrectly. She adjusted it gently, checked that the circulation was comfortable, and gave a reassuring nod before stepping away again. The teenager looked down at the corrected strap, then at his own partner. Instead of returning to practice, he knelt to help his friend adjust the other glove as well. Daniel noticed the exchange immediately. The lesson was already moving beyond Emily. It no longer depended on her presence. It lived in the decisions other people were beginning to make. The senior coach slowly removed the class schedule from the wall and wrote a new sentence beneath the evening session in thick black marker. Safety before skill. Skill before victory. Nobody questioned where the words came from. They simply felt right after everything they had witnessed. Several students stopped before leaving to read them one more time. The black belt quietly erased his own name from the whiteboard where he had listed himself as lead demonstrator for the afternoon. Beneath it, he wrote only one word: learning. Then he stepped aside and left the marker where the next instructor could use it. Emily noticed the change, but offered no comment. She only smiled faintly before reaching for the door handle. Daniel walked over, stopping just outside the exit so she would not feel blocked. He handed back the folded sheet of paper from his notebook instead of the laminated card. "I think this belongs to the people you are still teaching," he said. Emily looked at the handwritten sentence for a moment before gently pushing it back toward him. "Keep it," she replied. "It already found the right owner." Daniel folded it carefully and slipped it into the same notebook where it had rested for years. This time, however, he placed it in the very first page instead of hiding it in the back. The small change carried more meaning than any speech could have. As Emily stepped outside, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the parking lot. She paused beside a young maple tree growing near the sidewalk, noticing that one support strap had come loose after the recent wind. She crouched, tightened the strap with practiced hands, pressed the soil gently around the base, and stood again. Nobody inside the dojo could see her anymore. There was no audience left to impress. She simply noticed something that needed care and quietly made it better before continuing on her way. From the doorway, Daniel watched her disappear beyond the parking lot without calling after her. Behind him, the sounds inside the dojo had changed forever. There were no loud boasts, no playful taunts, no celebration. Only the steady rhythm of partners checking each other's footing, adjusting loose mats before training, and reminding one another to protect first and compete second. Earlier that day, the room had echoed with one man's words, "Do not forget who I am." By sunset, nobody remembered that sentence. What they remembered instead was a quiet woman who never needed to tell anyone who she was because every choice she made had already answered the question. The following Monday, the dojo opened exactly the way it always had. The lights came on before sunrise. The mats were rolled into place. The first students arrived carrying gym bags and paper cups of coffee, expecting another ordinary week of training. Yet something invisible had changed. Before anyone stepped onto the floor, 2 students quietly walked its length, checking every seam of the mats without being asked. Another noticed a loose corner near the equipment rack and flattened it before anyone else reached it. Nobody spoke about why. They simply did it because it now felt like the right way to begin. The senior coach watched from the office doorway with a quiet smile, saying nothing as the room prepared itself through dozens of small acts that had never been part of the written schedule. A few minutes later, the black belt entered carrying his own gear. The same students who had once laughed during demonstrations greeted him with friendly nods, but he did something none of them expected. Before warming up, he walked directly to a nervous newcomer standing alone beside the wall, introduced himself, and helped adjust the student's stance with the same patience Emily had shown him. When the newcomer apologized for making mistakes, the black belt answered with the words he had learned only days before. "We are here to learn." There was no trace of embarrassment in his voice anymore. Pride had quietly become responsibility. Across the room, the assistant coach updated the weekly lesson board. Below the class objectives, he left a blank line where students could write one safety observation before every session. By the end of the morning, the board contained reminders about loose straps, water bottles left near the edge of the mat, and making sure every partner understood a technique before increasing speed. None of the notes mentioned Emily, yet every one of them carried her influence. Daniel Brooks returned once that afternoon, not to teach and not to interrupt, but simply to observe for a few minutes before heading home. He noticed partners thanking one another after drills instead of celebrating successful techniques. He noticed experienced students helping beginners organize equipment before leaving. He noticed that nobody hurried past a problem expecting someone else to solve it. Quietly, he opened the old notebook he had carried for years. Beneath the sentence Emily had written long ago, he added one line in fresh ink. The lesson was never about surviving the fight. It was about protecting the people beside you. Then he closed the notebook with a gentle smile and walked away. Several miles across town, Emily finished another ordinary day at a small community self-defense program. The room was empty except for one folding chair left slightly out of place near the exit. She stopped, straightened it, switched off the lights, and locked the door behind her. Outside, she noticed a little girl struggling to zip her sports bag while her father balanced several grocery bags in one hand. Emily knelt for only a moment, fixed the stubborn zipper, wished them a good evening, and continued down the sidewalk before either of them had time to ask her name. The father thanked her. The little girl smiled. Emily simply lifted one hand in return without slowing her pace. By the time the evening traffic swallowed her into the crowd, she was already becoming another anonymous face walking home. Somewhere behind her, inside one dojo and inside many lives she had quietly touched, people were still choosing safer steps, kinder words, and steadier hands because of lessons they never realized they had been learning. They no longer remembered the challenge that had started everything. They remembered the calm woman who never argued, never boasted, never demanded respect, yet somehow changed an entire room through countless ordinary choices. And if someone new ever walked through those dojo doors feeling underestimated or uncertain, they would unknowingly inherit the same quiet standard she had left behind. Because in the end, Emily Carter never needed anyone to remember who she was. She simply gave people a better way to remember who they could become.